We start with this. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is hosting its first in-person business forum since its inception in 2020. Now, delegates, members of African states and various stakeholders will convene at the Cape Town International Convention Centre over the next 3 days. This is to advance the flagship project aimed at boosting intra-trade in Africa. So far, 54 African Union member states have signed the African Continental Free Trade Agreement as of March 2023. SABC News reporter Katlego Legodi and video journalist Masabata Ralitabo are covering the story for us, and we take you there now. Katlego, thank you for your time this morning. So the African Continental Free Trade Agreement Business Forum kicks off today. Why is this forum so important?
A very good morning to you, Mkolisi, and to our viewers at home. This is, of course, coming through at a very, very pivotal time for the African continent. So it's very important that those role players gather here today, and they'll gather for the coming 3 days. The aim really being to connect Africa, to connect the African economies through intra-trade. So as we speak right now, there have been challenges on the African continent. We've seen stumbling blocks in terms of these economies that are not moving, and they're not creating jobs, well-needed jobs. And we're also hearing, Mkolisi, that actually also the challenge coming through from the private sector's buy-in, which is why we are here today. This is why most of those delegates that will gather here today, tomorrow, and on Tuesday will actually ensure that they are having those discussions that will woo in and bring in the private sector into this forum. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. This is an agreement that was signed for by about 54 nations in counting, I must say, because this event here today also looking at convincing other nations that are still left behind on the African continent to form part of this agreement in ensuring at least that there's a move between the African economies. Yesterday, we saw the Secretary General of the AfCFTA, this being Wamkele Nene, just basically taken to the podium to welcome people here. But he started by just being frank about the challenges that they've faced over time in terms of just ensuring that there's a move here and there's a buy-in from the public and the private sector and small businesses on the African continent for one market, one African market for all. Let's just listen in on what he said yesterday as he was opening this session here yesterday.
As you know, there are significant challenges on the African continent. So this is why we are here in Cape Town, to encourage the private sector in Africa, to be part of implementation of the AfCFTA, to explore the opportunities that exist in agriculture, in the auto sector, in pharmaceuticals, and a range of different sectors where we believe further investment in these sectors will contribute to higher trade flows within the African continent.
So, Mkolisi, we're expecting about 1,200 of those delegates to converge here for the coming 3 days. The red carpet has been rolled out. The theme is African, so most of them will come here clad in their African regalia. But important is to ensure that those high-level discussions really find meaning here. So we're talking about various sectors of the economy within the African continent, this being around agro-processing. We're talking about the hospitality sector. We're talking about the automotive sector as well, some of those that will be tapped into in ensuring that there is also industrialization on the African continent through this agreement. So Mene as well yesterday just letting us in on why we find ourselves here today. Let's take a listen to that.
I've seen this in East Africa. We've seen it to a certain extent in the auto sector in Southern Africa, and we've seen the numbers. For example, the numbers of private sector investment double in the auto sector in Southern Africa as a result of AGOA, and certainly as a result of an expanded market under the SADC trade protocol. So clearly, where you have an instrument, a trade instrument that opens markets, it does have an incentive for significant investment.
So, Mxolisi, we're expecting to see Minister Ibrahim Patel, the Minister of Trade, Industries and Competition, in the afternoon open this address here today. But of course, that will be followed by various plenary sessions around the economy on the African continent and how it's moving and how it has to move in ensuring that it actually benefits those people that are on the ground, meaning the citizens. We are talking here about 54 nations that form part of this agreement here, and most of them will also be sharing the challenges that they are experiencing on the ground as they try by all means to solidify their economies and tap into these economies on the African continent. But when we're talking about the challenges that come through with what has been experienced in this space in policy, we're talking about tariffs that basically have played out in the space, that have made it hard for African countries to really connect with each other. We're talking about trade, import and exports in and out of the African continent. So most of those that will gather here for the 3 days will be talking about just creating a one channel, one route that will ensure that there is trade without the stumbling blocks or the challenges that have been experienced over time. So we're expecting to have frank discussions about where we find ourselves, and if indeed in the 3 years this agreement will find meaning, and the challenges that have been experienced over time. So brace yourself, Mxolisi, for high-level discussions on the ground, and here as the SABC will be bringing you those live coverage. Mxolisi?
Indeed, Katlego, and at the back of that opening address there, we heard how there is now a need for Africa, particularly business in Africa, to be working like one well-oiled machine. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to deliver a keynote address. Is this still the case?
Well, that is not the case, Mxolisi, I must say. So just getting from the organizers of this event here that last minutes or so they received messages around the fact that the president won't be attending here anymore. But we're expecting, of course, to see the champion of the Secretariat champion take to the podium later on just to give a keynote address here. And this will be followed, of course, by some of the financial ministers from the African continent that will also take to the podium in terms of addressing some of the issues that they are experiencing. We're expecting the private sector as well to play a crucial role here, as we know very well that they've positioned this engagement in the 3 days to try and convince the private sector that there is a buy-in, and those private sector stakeholders can actually come through and help here in moving the African economies. Most of the people here just looking forward to just high-level talks about basically what they can learn as well from each other as African economies to actually solidify and ensure that those stumbling blocks and those challenges are attended to. We're talking about industrialization here that has been the drive and actually the ambition of Africa, for the longest of time. So they're actually talking about one market for all that will ensure that there is industrialization, and issues like load shedding and the likes are attended to ensure that the energy crisis is actually dealt with in a way that it won't actually hamper this move towards industrialization. So frank talks to be addressed here, but government officials represented, of course, from South Africa by the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition will see them just engaging with their counterparts on the African continent and the private sector, public sector and the likes in ensuring that there is a move through this Africa Free Continental Area Agreement. Mxolisi?
And Katlego, interestingly, we always hear that Africa's time is now. It's time for Africa to make big moves. Can we really expect any trade agreements to be signed at this particular business forum? Because I know such forums have also come under harsh criticisms whereby, there's conversation that whatever happens there is just talk shop and nothing really comes out of it.
Well, we're expecting actually for them to really be frank, because the time for talk shop, most of them have been punting that the time for talk shop is over, and we need to see a move here in terms of actually making sure that everyone is on the same page on intervention. So we're expecting actually to see those trade agreements. We're expecting to see the exchange of ideas. We're expecting to see lessons drawn and learned from what has been happening in the 3 years, and we're expecting as well to see some of those agreements find finding meaning here, also tapping into the private sector, because the drive here is to ensure that the private sector, there's a buy-in as well from the private sector to ensure that this agreement finds its meaning. So we'll also be hearing about the challenges, really, because when you look at it, there were doubts also that were casted on this agreement and this area when it was formulated about 3 years ago. And we're actually going to see and hear from those that are here, the Secretariat as well, in terms of what those challenges have been and how the African economies can mitigate and move forward in ensuring that there is one market for all through those trade deals that some of them will tend to find meaning from today going forward.
Katlego, we park it here for now. Thank you so much for that update. Let's touch base in the next hour or so. That's Katlego Legodi on the African Continental Free Trade Area Business Forum, which is currently taking place at the Cape Town International Convention Center.